Now listen closely, because this is one of those truths that feels uncomfortable at first, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The people who seem the coldest, the most distant, the ones who pull back right when things feel real, are very often the ones feeling the deepest. And I know how wild that sounds, because from the outside, distance looks like disinterest. Silence feels like rejection, space feels like loss, and if you've ever been on the receiving end of an avoidance behavior, you've probably spent nights replaying conversations, rereading messages, wondering what you did wrong, wondering why someone who felt so connected suddenly felt so far away. You tell yourself, if they loved me, they wouldn't do this, and that belief feels logical, it feels sane, it feels fair. But here's the uncomfortable part, it's not how avoidance works. Not even close. For avoidance, love doesn't show up as warmth first. It shows up as danger. It shows up as pressure in the chest, a tightening in the stomach, a voice in the back of their mind saying, this is too much, this is risky, this can hurt you. So when you see distance, you're often not seeing a lack of love. You're seeing the nervous system hit the brake, and the more intense the feelings, the harder those brakes slam down. If you've ever felt confused by how someone could seem so emotionally invested, one moment and completely unreachable, next, you're not imagining things, but emotional whiplash is real. One day they're attentive, curious, deeply present. The next day, replies slow down. Energy shifts. You feel like you're suddenly chasing something that was freely given before. And that's where the pain really settles in. Because it's not just about missing them. It's about missing the version of them that showed up when things felt easy. You start questioning yourself. You start shrinking your needs. You start thinking maybe if you say less, feel less, want less, they'll come back. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to abandon yourself just to keep someone who seems halfway out the door. This is where so many people get stuck, because the distance feels personal. It feels like a verdict on your worth. But what if that distance isn't about your value at all? What if it's actually about how much you matter? One of the biggest myths about avoidance is that they don't care, that they're emotionally shallow, that they're incapable of love. That story gets repeated everywhere because it's easier than sitting with nuance. It's easier than admitting that someone can love deeply and still run from it. But avoidants aren't people who feel less. They're people who feel too much, too fast, without the internal tools to regulate it. Their independence isn't confidence, it's armor. Their emotional control isn't strength, it's survival. Most avoidants learned early on that needing someone came with a cost. That closeness led to disappointment, intrusion, or loss of self. So they adapted. They became self-sufficient. They learned to rely on logic instead of emotion. They learned to keep one foot out the door, not because they don't want connection, but because connection once hurt them deeply. And here's the part that flips everything upside down. When an avoidant truly doesn't care, they don't pull away dramatically. They don't spiral internally. They don't overthink. They simply drift calmly, quietly, without resistance. The intense pushback only shows up when the feelings are intense too. Avoidants experience love differently on a physiological level. For many people, closeness feels soothing. For avoidance, closeness activates the threat response. Their body doesn't register intimacy as safety. It registers it as vulnerability. And vulnerability feels like exposure. It feels like losing control. It feels like being seen in ways they never learned how to handle. So when love deepens, their nervous system reacts before their conscious mind even understands what's happening. They don't wake up and decide to pull away. Their body does it for them. Their emotions spike. And suddenly distance feels like relief. Space feels like oxygen. Silence feels like safety. And from the outside, it looks like they stopped caring overnight. But internally it often feels like emotional overload. Like standing too close to a fire. The warmth is nice until it starts to burn. This is why strong feelings are the biggest trigger for avoidance, not commitment, not labels, not even conflict. It's the intensity of attachment itself. When they start imagining a future, when they feel themselves emotionally prioritizing someone, when they notice that losing you would actually hurt, that's when the alarm goes off. Because love to them equals risk. Risk of dependence, risk of disappointment, risk of losing autonomy. So their system does what it was trained to do, create distance before the attachment goes too deep. This is also why avoidance can seem incredibly calm during breakups while the other person is falling apart. They've already shut down emotionally long before the words were spoken. That shutdown isn't peace, it's dissociation, it's a protective freeze. And it doesn't mean they don't feel. It means they're postponing the feeling until it's safe to feel it alone. Here's something most people never realize until much later. Avoidants often feel the most when they're away from you, when there's no pressure to respond, no expectation to show up, no demand for reassurance. Distance creates emotional safety, and emotional safety allows feelings to surface. That's why they suddenly think about you at night. That's why memories hit them out of nowhere. That's why they feel a wave of longing when you stop reaching out. It's not because they suddenly remembered you exist. It's because space gave them permission to feel without fear of being consumed by it. This is the paradox that hurts the most. The closer you try to get, the more they retreat. The more you let go, the more they feel. Not because you're playing a game, but because their nervous system finally relaxes enough to process attachment. If you've ever wondered why casual connections don't scare avoidance the way meaningful ones do, this is why. Surface level relationships don't threaten their sense of self. There's nothing to lose. No emotional dependency, no internal conflict. They can be charming, consistent, even affectionate when the stakes are low. But when depth enters the picture, when someone starts to really matter, when love becomes real instead of theoretical, that's when everything changes. That's when avoidance isn't a choice anymore. It's a reflex. And the tragedy is that the person they pull away from is often the one they care about the most. The one who touched something deep inside them. The one who made them feel seen. The one who mattered enough to activate fear. So, if you're sitting there wondering how someone could feel so distant while still holding space in your mind, hear this clearly. Distance is not always the absence of love. Sometimes it's the presence of fear, fear of losing control, fear of being hurt, fear of needing someone more than they know how to handle. And none of that means you should chase, overgive, or wait endlessly. But it does mean the story is more complex than they didn't care. Because often, the most distant avoidants aren't empty inside. They're overwhelmed. They're fighting feelings they never learned how to carry. And the closer love gets, the louder that fight becomes. And here's where it gets even more intense. Because once you understand this next layer, you stop taking their distance so personally, and you start seeing the invisible battle happening inside them. When an avoidant starts feeling deeply, it doesn't feel romantic on the inside. It feels like emotional overload. Imagine trying to hold something precious with hands that are already shaking. That's what love feels like to them. Too many emotions at once. Too many thoughts. Too much awareness of how badly it could hurt if it all goes wrong. So, their system looks for one thing only: relief. And the fastest relief is space. Not because they want to lose you, but because they're drowning in feelings they don't know how to regulate. While you're sitting there wondering why they're suddenly distant, they're sitting with a chest full of pressure thinking, why does this feel so intense? Why can't I calm down? Why do I feel like I'm losing control? Emotional overload doesn't look like crying for help and avoidance. It looks like silence, withdrawal, logic replacing emotion. Because logic feels safe when feelings feel unmanageable. This is why they often seem calmer. The moment they pull away, that calm can be misleading. It's not peace. It's numbness. It's the nervous system flipping into shutdown mode. And shutdown feels deceptively quiet. They might convince themselves they're better off alone. They might tell themselves they never needed you that much. They might rewrite the story in their head to justify the distance. But those stories aren't truth, they're coping mechanisms. Because sitting in the raw emotion of attachment feels too vulnerable. So instead of processing the feelings, they suppress them, they push them down, they delay them. And what doesn't get felt doesn't disappear, it waits. That's why avoidants often feel waves of emotion later, sometimes weeks, sometimes months after the distance has already been created. By then, you're already hurting, already questioning, already trying to heal, while they're just beginning to feel what you felt the moment they pulled away. And here's something that stings, but also brings clarity. The more meaningful the connection, the stronger the overload. If you barely mattered, they wouldn't feel this internal chaos. They wouldn't need to protect themselves so aggressively. Indifference doesn't cause panic. Love does. That's why you'll notice avoidance can maintain surface level connections with ease. They can joke, flirt, stay casual, keep things light. There's no internal threat there, no emotional weight, no fear of loss. But when a connection crosses a certain threshold, when it starts to feel emotionally significant, that's when the system goes into defense mode. And defense mode isn't gentle. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't reassure you. It just creates distance and hopes the pressure eases. This is also why avoidants often pull away right after moments of closeness, after deep conversations, after vulnerability, after emotional bonding, after things feel real. That closeness spikes attachment hormones in the brain, and attachment feels dangerous to someone who learned early on that closeness equals pain. So, their body reacts the way it was trained to react by creating space. You might replay those moments and think, everything was fine, we were closer than ever. And you're right. That's exactly why the pullback happened. Because closeness didn't scare them when it was distant or hypothetical. It scared them when it became real. Now, let's talk about one of the most misunderstood dynamics of all. Why avoidants don't struggle with casual connections the way they struggle with deep ones. This part can feel insulting if you don't understand it. You might think, so they can show up for other people but not for me. And on the surface, it looks unfair. But emotionally, casual connections don't require risk. There's no emotional investment to lose, no part of themselves on the line. They can walk away at any time without internal consequences. But when they start caring, really caring, suddenly the stakes are high. Suddenly the thought of loss hurts. Suddenly your opinion matters. Suddenly your absence would be felt. And that's exactly what they're trying to avoid feeling. Not because they don't value you, but because they don't trust themselves to survive the pain if it ends. This is where the most painful truth sits. The more you matter to an avoidant, the more they feel the urge to pull away. Distance becomes a way to regulate attachment, a way to keep the connection from becoming overwhelming, a way to love without drowning. And I know how unfair that feels, because from your side, love makes you want to lean in, communicate, connect, reassure. From their side, love makes them want to step back, stabilize, breathe. Two completely different responses to the same emotion. And when those two styles meet, the misunderstanding can feel unbearable. Another layer most people never talk about is how avoidants often try to protect love by hiding it. They don't trust expression, they don't trust promises, they don't trust vulnerability. So instead of saying what they feel, they contain it, they compartmentalize it, they keep it locked away where it can't be used against them. They might convince themselves that not expressing love keeps it safe, that if they don't name it, it can't be taken away. This is why you rarely hear grand declarations from deeply avoidant people, not because the feelings aren't there, but because saying them out loud feels like handing someone the power to hurt them. Silence, to them, feels like control. And here's a quiet truth that hits hard. Many avoidants are deeply loyal internally, even when they're distant externally. They don't always replace you emotionally as fast as it seems. They don't always detach the way it looks on the surface. Often, they carry emotional bonds silently. They replay memories. They think about what could have been. They feel guilt, regret, longing. But they don't reach out because reaching out means reopening the door to vulnerability, and vulnerability still feels unsafe. So they stay silent, not because you didn't matter, but because you mattered enough to hurt them. This is also why avoidants often think about you more when you're gone. When there's no expectation to respond, no pressure to perform emotionally, no fear of being pulled into something deeper than they can handle, their system relaxes. And when it relaxes, feelings surface. That's when they miss you. That's when nostalgia hits. That's when emotional clarity starts creeping in. Absence creates emotional safety for them, and emotional safety allows love to exist without panic. That doesn't mean you should disappear to get a reaction. It means their emotional world works in reverse. Closeness triggers fear. Space triggers reflection. So if you've ever felt like they only realize what they feel when you stop trying, you're not imagining things. It's the push-pull cycle at work, not because they're manipulative, but because they're dysregulated. They move toward connection, feel overwhelmed, pull away to calm themselves, then feel the loss once the pressure is gone. And unless they become aware of this pattern, it repeats over and over again, leaving you exhausted, confused, emotionally drained, wondering why love has to feel so hard. But here's the part that matters most for you. Understanding this doesn't mean tolerating pain. It doesn't mean waiting endlessly. It doesn't mean shrinking yourself to make someone feel safe. It means seeing the full picture clearly, so you stop blaming yourself. Because their distance is not a measurement of your worth. It's a reflection of their fear. And the most distant avoidance are often carrying the deepest feelings. Feelings they never learned how to hold without running from them. And in the next part, things get even clearer because we're going to break down how to tell the difference between avoidant distance and true disinterest, and why confusing the two keeps people stuck far longer than they should be. So now we arrive at one of the most painful questions people carry quietly in their chest. How do you tell the difference between avoidant distance and genuine disinterest? Because from the outside, they look almost identical. Silence feels like silence. Pulling away feels like pulling away. And when you're emotionally invested, your mind doesn't want nuance. It wants certainty. You want to know whether to stay, to leave, to hope, or to let go. And this is where so many people get trapped, because they assume distance always means lack of feeling. But with avoidance, distance often shows up precisely when feelings deepen. The difference isn't in the space itself, it's in what happens underneath it. When an avoidant is truly uninterested, there's no internal struggle, no back and forth, no emotional friction. They don't think about you intensely when they're alone. They don't replay moments. They don't feel conflicted. They simply move on with a quiet detachment. Their distance feels neutral, calm, almost indifferent. But when an avoidant is deeply attached and pulling away out of fear, the distance feels charged, heavy. You can sense it. There's tension beneath the silence. Inconsistency, hot and cold behavior, sudden warmth, followed by sudden withdrawal. That's not disinterest. That's emotional conflict. That's someone fighting feelings they don't know how to integrate. This is why avoidant distance often feels confusing. Instead of final, you don't feel fully rejected. You feel suspended, like something unresolved is hanging in the air. Because it is, avoidance rarely end things cleanly when they care. They fade, they pause, they stall. They create ambiguity because ambiguity allows them to avoid both intimacy and loss at the same time. It's a way of staying emotionally connected without fully committing or fully letting go. And while that might feel safer for them, it's incredibly destabilizing for the person on the other side. Another sign that distance isn't disinterest is when pressure makes things worse. When you ask for clarity and they shut down. When you express feelings and they retreat. when you seek reassurance and they pull away even more. If they truly didn't care, those conversations wouldn't affect them. They wouldn't feel overwhelmed. They wouldn't need to escape. But when emotions intensify their fear, closeness feels like a threat. So instead of leaning in, they create space to regain control. Not because your needs are unreasonable, but because emotional demand activates their deepest survival patterns. And here's where the misunderstanding gets even deeper. Many people believe that if they just explain themselves better, love harder, show more patience, the avoidant will feel safe enough to stay. But for avoidance, safety doesn't come from intensity. It comes from autonomy, from choice, from not feeling cornered by emotion. That's why chasing pleading or over-explaining almost always backfires. It turns love into pressure, and pressure triggers resistance. The more they feel emotionally obligated, the more their nervous system pushes back. They don't experience obligation as devotion. They experience it as loss of freedom. This is also why avoidants often reinterpret love as expectation. They start associating closeness with responsibility, with having to show up emotionally in ways they don't feel equipped for. And once love starts feeling like a role they can fail at, withdrawal becomes the only way to protect themselves from shame. Because deep down, many avoidants believe they're not good at relationships, that they'll disappoint you, eventually, that they'll hurt you. And instead of staying and risking that outcome, they leave preemptively. Distance becomes a way to avoid failing someone they actually care about. Now, let's talk about the illusion of indifference. Avoidants are masters at appearing unaffected. They intellectualize emotions. They minimize feelings. They rationalize distance. From the outside, it can look like they don't care at all. But inside, many avoidants are emotionally frozen, not empty. Their calm isn't peace. It's containment. They've learned how to turn down the volume on their emotions so they don't overwhelm them. And when emotions start leaking through anyway, they retreat further inward, not because they're heartless, but because they're scared of what will happen if they let themselves feel fully. This emotional paralysis is often misread as cruelty, as lack of empathy, as emotional unavailability by choice. But for many avoidants, emotional expression was never modeled as safe. They weren't taught how to sit with feelings, share them, regulate them. So when love surfaces, they don't know what to do with it. It doesn't feel empowering. It feels destabilizing, and rather than risking vulnerability, they default to what's familiar: distance, self-reliance, emotional silence. This is why avoidants rarely confess love directly. Saying it out loud feels irreversible. It feels like crossing a line they can't uncross. Once love is named, it becomes real. And once it's real, it can be lost. It can be used against them. It can expose them to pain they don't know how to handle. So they show love indirectly, through consistency when they can manage it, through actions rather than words, through staying connected in subtle ways, and sometimes through staying away, because staying feels safer than risking the depth of what they feel. And here's a truth that hurts, but also heals. Avoidants often fall hard, harder than they ever admit. But instead of leaning into those feelings, they try to control them. They try to downplay them. They try to outthink them. They tell themselves they don't need anyone. They convince themselves they're better off alone. And for a while, that story works until the feelings resurface. Because unprocessed attachment doesn't disappear. It waits. It shows up in quiet moments, in memories, in comparison, in the lingering sense that something meaningful was left unresolved. This is also why avoidance can seem emotionally unavailable while still being deeply affected by past connections. They carry emotional imprints silently. They don't always replace bonds easily. They don't always detach cleanly. They just don't know how to revisit those feelings safely, so they bury them under distance and distraction. And from the outside, it looks like they moved on, but inside, something unfinished remains. Understanding this can shift how you see everything, but it doesn't mean you sacrifice yourself. Because here's the most important distinction of all: understanding why someone pulls away doesn't mean you accept being emotionally deprived. It doesn't mean you wait indefinitely. It doesn't mean you abandon your needs. It means you stop personalizing their fear. You stop interpreting their distance as proof that you weren't enough. Because often, the most distant avoidants aren't pulling away because you asked for too much. They're pulling away because they felt too much. And in the next part, we're going to talk about what actually makes an avoidant feel safe enough to return. Not chasing, not convincing, not proving your worth, but something far more subtle and powerful. So now we're at the part most people get wrong, and it's understandable why. When someone pulls away, the instinct is to pull them back, to explain more clearly, to love harder, to prove safety through effort. But for avoidance, safety is not created through intensity. It's created through absence of threat. And threat, to them, isn't conflict or drama. It's emotional pressure. It's the feeling that they're expected to be something they don't fully trust themselves to be. So, what actually makes an avoidant feel safe enough to return isn't persuasion, it's space without punishment. It's autonomy without abandonment. It's knowing they can move at their own pace without being chased, cornered, or emotionally managed. When they sense that closeness won't cost them their freedom, their nervous system finally begins to soften. And only then do feelings have room to breathe. This is where so many people accidentally push avoidance further away without realizing it. Because when you try to secure love by tightening your grip, it communicates danger to someone whose core wound is losing themselves in a relationship. Even gentle pressure can feel overwhelming if it activates old fears. Avoidants need to feel that connection as a choice, not an obligation, that they're not being evaluated, rushed, or measured by how much they express. When they feel free, their attachment system paradoxically becomes more accessible. They begin to lean in, not because they're being pulled, but because they're not being pushed. And here's a hard truth that deserves honesty. You cannot regulate an avoidance nervous system for them. You cannot love them into healing. You cannot weight them into awareness. Understanding their behavior can bring compassion, but it should never cost you your self-respect. Because while avoidants pull away out of fear, staying in a dynamic where your needs are consistently unmet creates its own kind of harm. The goal isn't to endure distance. The goal is clarity, and clarity comes from watching actions over time, not explanations or potential. One of the biggest mistakes people make is confusing patience with self-abandonment. Patience has boundaries. It has mutual effort. It has growth. Self-abandonment is when you keep shrinking to accommodate someone else's fear. And avoidants don't need you to disappear emotionally so they can feel safe. They need to learn how to tolerate closeness without shutting down. That work is internal. It cannot be outsourced to your silence or your sacrifice. Another subtle but powerful truth is this: avoidants are often more affected by your emotional stability than your emotional availability. When you remain grounded, calm, and centered in yourself, it signals safety, not indifference, not coldness, but self-trust. When you don't chase, don't plead, don't over-explain, you're not playing games. You're communicating that you can stand on your own 2 feet. And that energy is strangely comforting to someone who fears emotional entanglement. It says, you can come closer without being consumed. And if you don't, I'll still be okay. That's not distance as punishment. That's distance as self-respect. This leads us to one of the most important realizations in this entire conversation. The thing that pulls avoidance back emotionally is often the very thing people are afraid to do: letting go of control. Not letting go of love, but letting go of managing the outcome. Because when you stop trying to regulate their emotions for them, you stop feeding the dynamic that keeps them stuck. You step out of the push-pull cycle. And without that cycle, the avoidant has to face face their feelings without the distraction of resistance. Now, let's talk about the one mistake that pushes avoidance further away, faster than almost anything else. It's not expressing needs, it's not wanting closeness, it's trying to force emotional resolution before they're regulated enough to handle it. Pressing for clarity when they're overwhelmed doesn't create honesty. It creates shutdown. Demanding reassurance when they're dysregulated doesn't create security. It creates escape. This doesn't mean your needs are wrong. It means timing matters. Emotional conversations require emotional capacity, and avoidants often need space to regain that capacity before they can show up authentically. But here's where balance comes in, because this part is crucial. You are not required to wait indefinitely for someone to catch up emotionally. Understanding avoidant behavior is meant to bring clarity, not excuses. You can hold compassion while still choosing yourself. You can understand fear without tolerating neglect. You can love someone and still walk away if the dynamic erodes your sense of self. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for both of you is stop participating in a cycle that keeps triggering wounds on both sides. The truth that changes how you see avoidance forever is this: distance is not always the absence of love, but love alone is not enough to sustain connection. Fear can coexist with affection. Longing can coexist with withdrawal. And just because someone feels deeply doesn't mean they're ready to love healthily. Avoidants are not villains. They're not broken. They're people who learn to survive by staying emotionally contained. But survival strategies don't automatically turn into relationship skills. So if you've ever felt discarded, confused, or unworthy because someone pulled away, let this land gently. Their distance is not a verdict on your value. It's a reflection of their internal conflict. And while the most distant avoidants are often the ones who feel the most, your job is not to chase feelings that can't meet you in the open. Your job is to honor your needs, protect your emotional energy, and choose connections that don't require you to disappear to be loved. Because real love doesn't ask you to decode silence. It doesn't ask you to shrink your heart to make someone comfortable. It doesn't live in constant uncertainty. And when you finally stop measuring yourself by someone else's fear, you create space for something healthier to enter your life, whether that's growth within the connection or the clarity to move on without self-blame. And that's the quiet truth behind this paradox. The most distant avoidants are often the most in love, but love without safety, without communication, without growth, remains trapped inside them. And you are allowed to want more than love that only exists in silence.